We acknowledge that this roundtable discussion is taking place on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge we are on the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. My name is Nathan Singh, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's discussion. I come from a family of Chinese-Canadian pioneers. My great-grandparents were pioneers in British Columbia, and they both paid the head tax when they immigrated to Canada. On behalf of the York Centre for Asian Research, the Institute for Social Research at York University, the Multicultural History Society of Ontario, and the Chinese-Canadian National Council for Social Justice, we welcome you to this virtual roundtable discussion to commemorate and raise awareness around the long-experienced trauma that stemmed from the historic Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act in Canada. This roundtable also jumpstarts two upcoming milestones. May 17, 2022 marks the 75th anniversary of the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act that came into force on July 1st, 1923. It was the last of a series of Chinese immigration acts that imposed, among other restrictions, a tax on Chinese persons entering Canada. No other immigrant group was subject to such a tax. The movement for redress began with a simple request. In 1983, two elders of the community, Mr. Dak Leon Mark and Mr. Shak Lee, with head tax papers in hand, approached Vancouver NDP MP Margaret Mitchell to ask that Canada repay them for the cost of the head tax.
There were a number of times where you see all these old timers, accompanied by their spouse or their children, lining up to get to the registration desk. Much as we keep saying, oh, Chinese Canadian have been here for over 150 years, and then we were celebrating over 125 years. The numbers didn't mean much until you put a face, and these are the old timers, and then you can really feel, that there's a human story behind each number and each head tax payment.
In 1984, the Chinese-Canadian National Council stepped forward and spearheaded a national redress movement. As president, Gary Yee became the face of the head tax redress campaign.
I was national president from 1987 to 1991. I'm now a vice president of the Chinese-Canadian National Council for Social Justice. I'm an immigrant myself. I came in 1964, and this is part of a common family structure or history for Chinese Canadians. My grandfather on my mother's side came in 1917, so he paid the head tax. He was, I think, about 20 years old, and it was $500 at the time, which is about 2 years' wages back then. And so, like many other, like the over 85,000 people who paid that head tax, he saved up money to go back to China, and he fathered two children when he was there in 1923, 1924, a daughter and a son. Comes back to Canada, goes back to China again, fathers another daughter. Then finally in 1952, 5 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. So that's like 35 years of being separated from his wife, my grandmother, and his children. But finally in 1952, his wife is able to come to Canada. But it was not until 1964 that his oldest daughter reunited with the whole family here. That daughter brought along her family of 8 children, and one of them was me.
The head tax redress campaign was an awakening for many people, including Susan Eng, who is a founding board member of the Chinese-Canadian National Council. At the height of the campaign, Susan was the chair of the Coalition of Head Taxpayers, Families, and Friends.
I was well into the campaign before I stopped to think that maybe my father had paid the head tax. So I went through his materials. He had died several years before. And I had a look, and there it was, a head tax certificate. It really was the first time I ever gave it any thought. Before that, of course, the campaign was more abstract, if you will, the issue of justice and 22 years of legislated racism and the need for a parliamentary apology. I mean, that was my motivation. And then when I was forced to have a look at my father's own documents, I realized that this was, of course, personal. And so it wasn't until after the Exclusion Acts were repealed that he was able to, marry my mother.
Tom and Marian Lam don't see themselves as activists or advocates, but the government's decision in 2005 to not offer an apology fueled their passion.
Yes, my grandfather came to Canada in 1912. June 25th.
1912.
1912. He landed in Vancouver. He had to pay $500 head tax.
I practically grew up here. Like my family immigrated here when I was 6 years old. And we didn't learn any of this in history. And our parents never talked about it. And our parents didn't even really know that much about it because my parents immigrated at a different time than Tom's grandfather. And then with me working at the Human Rights Commission, that really opened up our eyes. And that taught us that we should be involved.
Yeah, the Enki Mark said that at that time, I don't agree we should receive an apology or receive individual compensation. So therefore, Susan Eng's group, Coalition of Chinese Head Taxpayers and Families, was excluded from the committee because of its demands.
So I actually became involved in the campaign before I joined the board of CCNC-TO. I was working for the national office in the summer of '88, and that was the high, that was when Gary Yee was the president, and they really started a campaign. A couple of years later, I got funding from the Court Challenges program to start looking into the possibility of doing a charter challenge, and then reached out to some of the well-known constitutional lawyers to give me their input. And we started the class action lawsuit in 1999. The government responded with a motion to strike. And then I think the Supreme Court dismissed the appeal in 2001.
Community activism runs deeply throughout the Chinese community. Head tax redress activism followed in tradition of the pioneers who led strikes, organized boycotts, formed trade unions, and took to the streets. Each generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before.
There were a number of families activist families. And so, our kids end up growing up together. So there was there was a community. So when my mother would go out to do leafleting in Chinatown, she would always bring one of the kids. Sometimes it's not just our own, her grandkids, but other friends' kids too. So it becomes an event, it becomes an activity, it becomes a community engagement piece. So that's that sense of you keep passing on, and sometimes as parents or as community activists, we act or we lead by doing it. To me, I think from a social movement perspective, it's you are always, as a community activist, we are always constantly organizing. Because you never know when the next spark or next moment would appear out of the blue, and you need to be, your capacity, your community needs to be ready.
Karen Lee, an award-winning filmmaker, also has deep personal ties with the issue and a long family history in Canada.
My grandmother, who settled and joined her husband in Stoughton, he had, for those 3 decades or more, had already started another life with another woman, and secretly had like a family. So she didn't last long. My grandmother, she was here for about a year, and then she committed suicide. So that's one of those things that you actually don't hear about in your own family until somebody, sort of nudges you and says, well, did you know that all these people were separated for all these years? Did I even know about the head tax? Within my own family, nobody really talked about it. Even my father, who was extremely political, he was a socialist and ran a communist bookstore in Vancouver, promoting, gender equity and all of that kind of stuff. So little did I know that, it was his mother that committed suicide. And so his activism in the community, I just came in as second generation to be part of the activist community and to give voice to people who didn't have the opportunity to do so. So that's kind of my family's side of head tax activism, all kinds of other activism, obviously, for new immigrants and so on. Those stories are generally ones that people will take to their grave and not really discuss that with their families. And so really one of the things around the head tax redress is the act of actually talking about their stories became a very important thing, because we were organizing to get their stories out there, because now with all the organizing that we were doing, the politicians were starting to take notice, and they were asking about, personally coming to hear some of those stories of the seniors and their families.
We're talking about over 3,000 surviving head taxpayers in the 80s who, like my grandfather, he passed away in 1989, but, who, like my grandfather, paid the head tax. They were not ancient history, like some people might try to make out this issue to be. These were surviving head taxpayers who directly were affected by the 62 years of legislative racism, lasting until 1947.
Bradley, a media specialist, also became involved during this very critical time and put in his efforts to lead a well-organized media campaign. He was inspired by one particular head taxpayer named Wong.
Actually, he was riding his motorbike, and I think he called it a ride for redress, across Canada from Vancouver to Ottawa to place a petition to get the redress campaign started and to get an apology and compensation for the Head Tax and Exclusion Act, which he and his family had suffered under for many years. In fact, most people who Chinese Canadians whose families have been here for generations have experienced some form of suffering under that very, very unjust poll tax on people that were of Chinese heritage coming into Canada, the only ethnic group that ever experienced that sort of treatment in Canada. But over the years and the generations, we now pride ourselves as Canadians about our values, our normative values of multiculturalism and diversity. So Gim started out, and I didn't know anything about it until he'd already passed through Toronto and was on his way to Ottawa. And the question arose, well, why doesn't anybody know about this? And I think Gim had a very noble cause in his mind, and the people around him certainly did. But nobody had done any of the planning and the groundwork to draw it to anybody's attention. They just thought they could phone up the newspapers and everybody would be happy and they would jump on it and do it. But that's not generally how news works. You mentioned that, yes, there was the sporadic coverage of head tax. But back in the late 80s and early 90s, Canadian governments just basically said after the settlement and the apology to the Japanese Canadians in 1988, that they were done with any forms of apologies to ethnic groups. From my point of view, as not drawing on my Chinese heritage. I mean, drawing on the Chinese heritage and the history in Canada and seeing how inequitable it was. But drawing on my Canadian values of what my Canada is, that's what really forced me to act.
Despite the Chinese community's determination to forge ahead with redress, the campaign was riddled with roadblocks. Like the Chinese CPR workers, they navigated around what seemed like insurmountable obstacles.
Yeah, that's where we started from. We had to fight against in this redress camp. We had to fight against existing, misguided, misdirected policy. As a journalist, I got involved, and I wanted to find out what the situation was with CCNC and NCCC, Chinese Canadian National Council, National Congress of Chinese Canadians. I launched the Freedom of Information Act, asking specifically for government correspondence between Ministry of Heritage and the CCNC and the NCCC. They had no clue who they were dealing with. They have no understanding of the community. And yet, for political expediency, they were willing to dish out $12.5 million to sweep the entire issue under the rug.
And then there was a lot of infighting between all of these representative organizations. And so the demands were very different, very diverse, from we don't want an apology, says the NCCC. All we want is an acknowledgement and give us some money to commemorate those who were head tax survivors, to the BC Coalition and CCNC saying, no, we want not just that acknowledgement, but we want an apology in the House, and obviously the compensation for the seniors. So that negotiation, of course, was a very difficult one, with all these different groups sort of pitting one over another, which is exactly what the government wanted. The government wanted this divide and conquer situation where people would be fighting against each other on a community level. And that's exactly what happened.
You know, we know from 1984 to 2006, that's 22 years of a redress campaign. And we knew it wouldn't be easy, especially when we started coming up with a position that included individual financial redress or compensation for the head taxpayers.
The key to all of this was the historical colonial attitude of the government of all stripes. And when communities were going to raise an issue, the government just tried to find somebody else who happened to be Chinese to hold an opposing view. Regardless, they never thought that it was a national issue. They just thought it was, you know, an ethnic community that needed to be managed. And really, nothing really changed until we demonstrated that we could be influential during a political campaign, that we could actually get our arguments onto the front pages of the newspapers and leading the newscasts. Then it became useful for the politicians to actually address the issues full on.
It, you know, with both the Mulroney and Chrétien governments, we did not get too far. There were glimmers of hope, but really we succeeded much more in public education. Back then, we were working from the outside. We did not have access to the inner, cabinet ministers or the senior political staffers. So it was difficult. We held community meetings. We gathered support from other groups, prominent people. We had, we increased our media profile. We conducted research, published materials, made presentations at schools. We did lots of things. We were very busy, worked with, and so over 4,000 head taxpayers or their widows or descendants registered their head tax certificates. So we wanted to represent them. We knew we had a strong case, but strong cases don't always mean successful cases.
Brad's father also had connections with the PC government and helped push head tax redress towards national awareness.
We had some connection, but Dad also knew a guy that we felt was really, really, he was a, I don't know if it's true, if you can say this, but in the same breath, he was a principled politician. But it was first brought to the attention of the government because Jim Prentice, who was at the time in opposition in the shadow cabinet, he brought it up. He brought it up in shadow cabinet meetings, and he says, and what he was reacting to was a private member's bill. Private members' bills often are used in Parliament to voice a concern, but where nothing ever gets done about it. It gets put into the Hansard parliamentary record, and that's about it. Then eventually the election writ dropped, and they went into election. But because there was enough political interest in this Chinese Canadian justice bill around redress for the head tax and exclusion act, it survived through the election campaign. And so I got involved. I was writing daily press releases and stuff like that, and I was also building a national network. I was reaching out to people and known activists in Vancouver, obviously Calgary, where I'm from, Montreal, Halifax, all the big regional cities, and anywhere that I spotted in the news that there was additional interest from local Chinese Canadian groups, I would reach out and support them. But what that did is it extended our power, I suppose, our influence or whatever. But I tried to make it as equitable as possible.
Broad community support had pushed this issue into the public sphere, with much of the work falling on the shoulders of the CCNC Women's Issues Committee. In addition to the day-to-day work of sustaining the campaign, the committee was involved with 2 public education events that had far-reaching appeal. But Women Did Come, a photo exhibit on the history of Chinese pioneer women, co-sponsored with the Multicultural History Society of Ontario, and a book publication, Jin Guo, Voices of Chinese Canadian Women.
Their lived experiences, their contributions, their hardships, and their tremendous resilience were shown through the book as well as that photo exhibit. So those, of course, they were not directly about redress. However, they definitely were about redress, right? We're talking about the early days, the pioneers of the Chinese Canadian community. More importantly, the overlooked voices of women, their role, their status, their position in the communities, and how they put up with all the hardships to build family, to build society, to build community, to make it thrive, to make it, to not only survive, but make it thrive and succeed, within those tremendously hard times. And so those also, of course, helped further the understanding and further the awareness raising about early Chinese Canadians, the communities, the women in particular, and of course further advance why we need justice for them.
Indeed, many felt the male voices were the most prominent and served the campaign in front-facing leadership roles. Actually, the women who worked behind the scenes did much of the heavy lifting, though they were often overlooked for their efforts.
Women were doing all the actual work in organizing and many of these events, right? Like, whatever, we had a large meeting with the head taxpayers or descendants, for instance, right? Like, the women are the one who was like, book the space, sort of like do the flyer or, whatever, right? And then the men will kind of go to the mic and say something at the end, right? So, so a lot of the organizing work was done by women. Just many people over the years have been involved in the head tax movement. So, my sister was involved, definitely, people like Mary Eng, right? We worked with over the years and, continue to be supportive of our work.
Even when we talk about head tax campaign, the focus, the focus had been always on the payers. When there could have been another intersectional approach in highlighting the experiences of the women, the the spouses who were left behind, the spouses who end up enduring all the challenges in the home villages, raising their kids at the scorn of their relatives, and then coming over, braving a whole new world. We end up focusing on the men without recognizing the women as survivors made equal, if not more, contributions as well.
And they provided, the much needed kind of representation of women of their various generations. So, even though there was a very patriarchal system that had been in place for over 100 years, it started to move forward.
Simon Lee was the host of a popular Chinese radio show, Power Politics. On December 2nd, 2005, he was able to sit down with then Prime Minister Paul Martin for an interview.
I think he was at that time working on a master's in history at Queen's University. I thought, I should reach out to Chinese media as well, Chinese language media, because, they always really, just by their very nature of being Chinese language media, they care about Chinese Canadian identity. I reached out and I started a conversation with Simon. We got to be good pals just around issues around media, also around seeking equity in media. China, the ethnic press is not paid anywhere near what the salary of a journalist at the Toronto Star is. So Simon goes, he says, well, I'm going to go. He says, what should I talk about? I said, well, I don't know. It's up to you. Do you want to do something that's just going to be general plain Jane, but you're going to cover all the bases? Talk to him about the things that the government already covers. And I talked to him. I probably spoke to him for about half an hour about that. And then he says, oh, this seems all pretty regular. I said, yeah, okay. Or ask him why he's insistent on acknowledging, commemorating, and educating about Chinese exclusion and head tax and discrimination against Chinese, but he will not apologize. Just keep asking him. I said, he's going to dodge you left and right, is going to be trained and media trained not to bring up the word apology, because the Canadian government stance currently, or at that time, is that if we apologize, that opens the door to liability, and we could be on the hook for a lot of money. But Simon kept answering, yes, but if it's so easy, then why won't you just apologize? Well, it's like I said, acknowledge, commemorate, educate, and it went round and round in circles, and then finally got out of that. And you can imagine, like, if that showed up in a national newspaper, it was a catalyst for the Chinese community.
During the 22-year-long campaign, there were several pivotal moments that spun into the direction its supporters wanted. The 2006 federal election was one of those moments.
We became an election issue for the Tories, for the PC's election campaign. It became a political opportunity with mutual benefits for all concerned.
A lot of these kinds of issues get hotly debated within the Chinese language media and never outside. And this happened during the election in 2005, and before that as well, as we engaged in a number of other issues. These issues got well covered in the Chinese language media, but never made it into the broader, public awareness. And one of the big differences in the 2005 election campaign was that we were able to infiltrate the English language media, which meant that the politicians finally had to actually deal with it. Our point was, look, this racism was brought together in Parliament. So the apology has to take place in Parliament. And that was the historical fact that we wanted to have on the records.
Lesser known still is the political influence of the Canada-Tibet Committee, as well as the intervention of a lawyer named Richard Ling. When a sitting Conservative MP at the time was hesitant to support the head tax redress, Ling committed to raising $100,000 for any candidate who would support the redress to run against the MP. Another interesting occurrence relates to my family. Minutes before a redress meeting was convened at my aunt's house, a phone call came seeking support for sitting MP Liberal Ujjal Dosanjh. My aunt replied, "No one in this family will be voting Liberal because of the party's position on head tax redress. In fact, community members are arriving to my home now for a meeting on head tax redress. Perhaps that call had an impact. Weeks later, 2 sitting Liberal MPs refused to support the position of no apology and no redress. Ujjal Dosanjh was one of them.
For some reason, the Liberals just couldn't get it together to do that. The Conservatives saw the political value of doing that, and ultimately it was they who gave us the promise of a parliamentary apology.
On the front page, I remember it was a single column along the right side of all the other, the above the fold story, the big art, then the other story, and then stick down the side. And it was, the headline was something along the lines of how an 1885 head tax law became an issue in the 2006 election. And I thought, yes, we've done it. It's on the agenda. It was a lot of work, a ton of work. Eventually, Canadians went to the polls and they toppled the Paul Martin government, electing the Stephen Harper government with the majority.
Susan, Amy, and others shared memorable moments from the Symbolic journey across Canada, which delivered hundreds of head taxpayers and their families in Ottawa to witness the parliamentary apology. This was a grassroots initiative that picked up steam and supporters in the latter stages of the campaign.
I think since, Via Rail or CN benefited from the work of the Chinese railroad workers, maybe we can get them to pick up Chinese head taxpayers from the West Coast and bring it to Ottawa and pick up head taxpayers along the way.
At some point, I think it was Susan who had actually reached out to Via Rail. I think in very short terms said, well, we're planning to bring all of our seniors to Ottawa and Parliament for the apology. They will be in attendance and you're going to be footing the bill for this. I was amazed about this kind of, in your face kind of, firm, somewhat polite request that this would actually happen. And so we just started to proceed as if that was the plan.
There was this last spike that Pierre Burton had acquired from, I guess, CN or CP, I'm not sure which, when he wrote the book, The National Dream. And he had given it to A.V. Go. I thought, well, look, here's the story. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take the last spike to Vancouver, and head taxpayers were carried onto the train. And we're going to get it all the way back to Ottawa, back to the railway committee room where they made the decision to build the railroad. And when they finished building the railroad and drove in the last spike in BC, no Chinese worker was allowed into the picture, despite the fact that they had given their lives, many of them, to build this railroad. So that was the messaging.
Susan, actually, I think she boarded the train in Vancouver to make sure that all the seniors were well taken care of. She was there with her own mother. Then as the train made stops across Canada, they picked up more and more Chinese seniors. All this time in the background, we were still trying to organize and make sure the right people got to Ottawa and to Parliament for the apology. As little as 3 days and even 2 days out, we hadn't even been assured that there would be any place for people to stay when they got to Ottawa. We eventually got to Parliament Hill, and as we're going to get in, we're told that the gallery, the public gallery in Parliament, has been totally booked. It's all full. I said, we all need to be in the House of Commons, in the House of the people that represent us as Canadians. We all need to be there. We need to see it in real life, and we need to be, certain that it actually happens.
15 years ago today, on June 22nd, 2006, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized in the House of Commons for over a century of legislated discrimination against the Chinese in Canada.
So we get there, we are all sitting in the public galleries. And as we were waiting for the Prime Minister to come in and make the statement, I looked around and I saw 300 older Chinese Canadians looking around, never once being in that place, not quite sure where they were. And they were going to watch their Prime Minister, someone they'd only seen on TV, say to them, Canada apologizes, both in English and in Chinese.
I was really, really happy to see a lot of our seniors there, because, you know, these are the people whose hardships through history have given us the chances and opportunities that we have today. And so I was grateful for that. So I did see Gim Wong. He was off to my right side on another part of the gallery. Gim was in his full military uniform that I guess he still had left over. He was a mechanic for the Royal Canadian Air Force. I was listening to Prime Minister Harper give the apology. As he was talking, some way midway through, or even more than midway through, all of a sudden I noticed, I think it was Peter MacKay in his cabinet, get up, and he turns over to, you know, where the elders are, and he stands up at attention like this. And I'm wondering what's going on. He snaps a really smart salute. I'm thinking, oh, so my eyes naturally follow where his salute is directed. And there's Gim Wong, the guy that, you know, not more than a year ago had driven his motorcycle from Vancouver to Parliament Hill to bring attention to the plight of the head taxpayers and their spouses, and the fact that many of them by that time had to be in their 80s or even older. You know, that's at the end of a human lifespan. So to see Gim at attention and saluting, and a cabinet minister acknowledging the salute, it was extremely moving. It was a very, very powerful moment. Something I'll never forget.
And just looking at those faces, the wonder, it was the idea that they were in the halls of power, many for the first time in their lives, and they were going to get an apology. And they were all in their 70s and 80s and 90s. One of the head taxpayers was 101.
Gary repeatedly mentioned an almost magical alignment of forces that made redress possible, but this was not sheer luck. Yes, it was partially to do with timing and access to political power, but it was preceded by decades of hard work by members of the CCNC and other community groups.
I think everything helped, right? Every single step towards redress helped. And it was building that momentum, building that understanding, including the photo exhibits, including the book, including, you know, the awareness raising about women in those pioneering years.
Community-based approach doesn't mean that you don't need access to power. So it's not like a either or, right? So like all of this, you need all of it, right? Like even the movement today, like it's like ultimately you want, like you're doing grassroots organizing, your object of the change is in the seat of the power. Like you have to convince whoever in power to change the law or change the policy.
It takes a lot of things to happen. Some of it is timing, some of it is luck, some of it, but a lot of it is built on the foundation. It's not like everything we did in the previous years didn't matter and it just happened to be a lucky convergence of events. You have to be in a position to seize the opportunity, to take advantage of timing. And I think we have built that strong foundation.
So it's not like people that were part of the head tax redress created everything and just magically put this together for the redress. It's actually, you know, you have to recognize that it's decades and generations of people who really wanted to work together to help the community get out of the stigmatization of being the poor, quiet Chinese Canadians.
I think in ways a result of what earlier generations did for us and the evolving history of our community that is defined by one thing, and that's our resilience.
So, you know, if they can do that, you know, and park their hopes and dreams for that long in their lives, us barking at politicians is nothing.
Yes, it was a sweet moment of victory to finally get the apology. but it also left some people really profoundly disappointed. And that had we gone an extra mile, maybe there could have been a better outcome. The apology, the statement could have just a bit stronger, acknowledging the survivors and the descendants, and also in building a more critical gender analysis into all the future work of CCNC and the community as well.
One thing I realized as we went through this campaign was how transformative redress could be for how we see ourselves as Canadians. So we did not meet that potential with our redress settlement. And that would be my one regret, that there was this potential to have something so big that it could transform how we see ourselves and how others see us. And for that, I think about the Japanese Canadian redress and how that defines that community. And how, for example, after that settlement and all the knowledge and information that comes from how we mistreated the entire Japanese Canadian community, it meant that when you see a Japanese person in Canada, you start connecting them with that wartime internment, that racist action. And what that means is it makes them Canadian. It links them to Canada, not Japan, not kimonos. So the promise that we had, which has not been fulfilled, but we will have to fulfill in other ways in this struggle. The promise that we had was that a proper redress could transform could cause a similar transformation with respect to Chinese Canadians in Canada.
But certainly it was worth doing because at least some of the surviving head taxpayers and widows got, redress. At least the government had to apologize and acknowledge the past wrong, and that it allowed us to also continue to use that to push for more issues of equality, racial equality.
To this very day, we have the head tax certificate hanging in every one of our homes. But we didn't realize that Tom's grandfather had paid this head tax until he passed away. I mean, when we had that head tax certificate, it generated so many conversations in our household. Because we would have friends come over and they would ask, what is this? And I said, that's a piece of Canadian history.
But we're not learning that in school.
Yes.
Even though in 2006, when Harper made the official apology at the House, at the Parliament, and among other things, there's supposed to be acknowledgement, compensation, and education. The education component has never been incorporated in the Canadian society or in the elementary textbooks or high school textbook. We don't learn our history, among other history that as part of Canadian history, but we're not learning them.
The most important thing that younger people, I think, intuitively already know is don't submit to authority. Don't assume that because somebody is a highfalutin politician, that what they say is the final word. You do have power in what you do, whether by the strength of your intelligence or your numbers or your persistence, it can make a difference. And I think that as we move along and deal with today's anti-Asian racism, because it's not over, that we are finding a lot of young people much more quick off the mark, no matter how many years it takes. The strength of the community is such that you're going to get redress. Maybe not immediately, but eventually.
I guess in working with Chinese local parents in the neighborhood and pushing for bilingual, heritage language programs, in a way has also given me a sense of, the need for us to come together rather than, or even as a community organizer, as a social worker, rather than treating each client, quote unquote, as individual, is a sense that we need to come together to express both our voice, our presence, as well as our power.
We now invite you to join our live Q&A session, where members of the public can address our panel of speakers. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if anyone can see me. I know that everyone in this chat can see me, but I don't know if I'm also going out to every single person that is watching this, but I'm going to assume that I am. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is a Q&A panel now, and we have 5 people that were a part of that beautiful documentary that Elliot Guinea and Dora Nitt put together. We have Gary Yi, Avi Go, Marian and Tom Lam, and Susan Eng joining us today. And if you have any questions to ask any of them, you can direct them in the chat, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can over the next 20 minutes. But the first question I have is for Gary. Nice to meet you, Gary. As someone that has worked as the face of the Head Tax Redress campaign, what went into keeping the campaign going for 22 years?
Well, I mean, I might have been the face in the early years, but then I went into government, and then you have to work behind the scenes, right? So certainly so many people and groups, it just kept it going, even in our darkest times when we had not much hope, to be honest. We knew that we would keep going and keep going, even though we know we would hear that the government will not redress. We would rather accept that no than to accept the things that did not satisfy us. So we felt a responsibility to the individual head tax registrants, right? The head tax payers, their widows, their families, they registered with Chinese Canadian National Council, and we felt that responsibility to them, and we felt the responsibility to the community, and so it's a long campaign. It had its ups and downs, and at different points, different groups, different people stepped up, like the BC Coalition, like the Court Challenge program and the Court Challenge. Different things just happened at different times to just keep it going until we had other people coming on and just all sorts of events happening to give us the eventual apology and redress. Way too late, but it was there.
Thank you, Gary. Avi, you were in charge of the last fight gifted by Pierre Burton. So were you the one that looked after it the entire time, and where is it now?
That's a good question. I have no idea where it is now. We think it's still at the railroad room or whatever, the parliament. I think at one point we actually sent an email to the Parliament Library or someone at the Parliament to ask to track it down. It was actually, it's interesting because I went to see Pierre Burton, I believe, to do a recording because we were doing some kind of I think it was during the, when we were trying to push for the class action lawsuit, and somebody made the connection. I believe it was Jun Callwood who helped us make the connection. I went to see him. And then he said, by the way, I have these 2 last bites. One of them I'm using as a door stopper. You want it?
Wow.
Like it's like it's very casual. So we brought it back. I kind of put it in the frame. I think it was Kristen Wong Tam reached out to a friend of hers who was an artist, give us a nice wooden frame, which I then carried across the country as we do the Last Bite campaign. Try to get the redress to continue, because at that time, the government has already said no. So it was an interesting kind of, and I remember taking it all the way to the Parliament, to Edmonton, and then at the Edmonton airport, they would not let me carry it onto the plane because it was in a glass case and they think it is a dangerous weapon. So I had to check it in, broke the glass, and then got another artist, or to get the artist to replace the case for us again.
From a dangerous object to a door stopper to
Yeah.
a major object, many things that Last Spike was. Thank you. So I have a question for Tom and Marion. What steps did you take to inform your children about head tax redress? And why did you feel it was important to do so if you did?
Well, what we try to impart some of the history to the younger generation. And with our grandson, Jackson, we show him the head tax certificate. And so he could relate that is his great-great-grandfather who came here in the 1912 and had to endure many years of separation from his wife. And so just a bit of a history and education. And we also impress upon them that our sons and grandkids and some of our nieces and nephews, we cannot sit back and to be complacent. All it takes is a stroke of a pen that we could be to be interned in the event that we have conflict with China. Just look at the pandemics right now, the Asian racism, anti-Asian throughout the country, more so down the States because of the politics down there. But we do have a lot anti-Asian racism in Canada. So we cannot be complacent. That's basically, we try to impart some of the history and emphasize that to the next generation. Do you have anything to add?
No,
Yeah.
no, I agree with exactly what Tom said. That's what we have been doing all these years.
Mhm.
It's from a very early age, we educate our children and our friends and whoever we come across.
Yeah.
Yes, we're always trying to keep this historical, facts alive.
Mhm.
And not just Asian friends,
Yes.
more importantly is the Caucasian friends that they need to be aware of
The Canadian history, yes.
So what steps do you think we need to make sure this is being taught to not only, people that have had great grandparents or grandparents or somebody in their family that did pay the head tax, but to all Canadians as, a pivotal point in Canadian history?
Well, it needs to be in the school system at a very young age. Like the same thing with any other kind of racial history, like with the Indigenous, with the Chinese, the Italians, like I could go on and on, right? And like all this is part of Canadian history.
exposed to learning the history of
the British. Yes.
That's part of the colonialism. We need to emphasize to the school system, Toronto School or Ontario or Canada for that matter, that they need to incorporate Canadian history, not just Asian. As Marian identified, that the Japanese internment, the Ukrainian internment, Italian internment. So all those are a part of Canadian history that we need to learn from very young age, elementary school to high school.
Thank you, guys. So as this is an open-ended question to any of the attendees that want to answer this, as a young person who's navigating the beginning of my own professional career, I found that learning about community-based activism from my own family, especially within my own family, gave me strength and direction to navigate the future. Do you have some words of support or inspiration to guide young people as we step up to counter the rise of reported anti-Asian hate crimes?
Well, for me, yeah.
You're on mute, Nathan. You're on mute.
There, I'm back. If anyone just wants to raise their hand, and then I can see who wants. Gary.
I'm physically raising my hand. If no one else wants to chime in, I mean, I think for young people, the key difference between now and decades of activism is the internet, and it just changes everything. I hope I'm not being too naive here, but I do think government, big institutions, corporations, they know the world is changed. They know that the power of the internet or social media, it can turn things around quickly. And so that's what I find encouraging. That's what gives me a sense of optimism that the power of the internet and our new world can really change how activism and advocacy happens. And it gives a lot more power to young people these days.
And Brad, I see your hand up. Brad Lee is joining us. I didn't get to introduce him when I was, I guess, introducing all the other panelists. Brad, how can young people harness the power of social media?
I think one of the best things everybody can do is to learn more of our history. It's not as out in the open as what would be considered mainstream today, although I hope that changes later. But it's all there. I mean, Canada's deep, dark histories around racism, it's all there. It's on the parliamentary record. You just have to bring it to the light of day. So know your history, study our history. I'm sure everybody on this panel, if any young person steps up and asks us a question, we will bend over backwards to help them. Beyond that, one single directive: take up control and control our community's narrative. That's up to everybody to learn the history and to control the narrative, so that as we progress through generations of our families in Canada, we control our own story and the way that people see us.
Susan, one of my favorite parts was when I think it was Brad said that you got Via Rail to put the bill for all of the seniors that were heading to Ottawa to witness the parliamentary apology. So now that collective activism would happen online, would happen on social media, with everyone collectively coming together to share information and to stand up to companies and, fight for justice. So how can young people harness that energy that you brought so many years ago today?
Well, here's the thing. You have to realize that self-interest is everything. So you have to identify the self-interest of the person or corporation that you want to do something. So is it a politician? What moves the politician? Public reputation and votes. What moves the corporation? Public image, business, all of that. So my pitch to Via Rail, which was a cold call, was to say, here's who I am, here's what we're going to do. And I have an opportunity for you to get 3 weeks of public media across the country. That was the pitch. I said, do you want it? It works for you. You can be the good guys here after a century, having your predecessor company killed all of my ancestors. Here's your opportunity to do a bit of redress and to get something out of it. Indeed, there were about 3 solid weeks of media, which for an issue like this takes some doing. It could be just a one-day wonder as media goes. So in this case, it worked out for them because every time we made a stop, the local media would show up, the national media were aware of it. When you have old people, they're immediately sympathetic. They're struggling to get up on the train. Via Rail was able to show how they had these elevators to get older people onto a train. Then you had like 300 taxpayers and their families in this train, all being Chinese, which is going to be covered by all of the media. So it was very useful for them, but I'm very grateful, even now for their ready agreement to being part of a historic event. So when we're talking about politicians doing something, now remember what was important here was finally we were able to make this issue, which was important to our community, important to the politicians who are running in a federal campaign. As you all know, many of the issues that concern a single community often just gets pushed by the wayside during a national campaign, electoral campaign, because it isn't as important as everything else. So, ours was a niche issue, but we made it an issue at every media availability of the politicians, and it got national coverage. So why did that influence the politicians? Well, because it was on the national media during a campaign, it was going to, or it might have, we didn't know for sure, but they thought that it might affect their vote. How many people would vote for them? And let's not be, many of the politicians were sincere in their support for us, but mostly they saw the potential vote value in it.
Thank you, Susan. I have a question from Karen Chan. So what can we do to be more involved? What can young people do to get involved, specifically to push our government to include the Chinese head tax in Canadian education? And this is an open-ended question. So if any of you want to answer this question or you have any insights, just raise your hand. What can people do to get involved and push the government to include this in Canadian education? Amy. Hi, Amy.
Hi. So actually, the Toronto District School Board has recently developed anti-Asian racism curriculum. And in the curriculum actually talked about, of course, history of Asian Canadians, including head tax, Exclusion Act, Japanese internment, and all that. So there are curriculum, and it's actually quite well developed. So the issue is not just having the curriculum. First of all, of course, now that we have these curriculum, and should not be just applied in Toronto, it should be applied nationally. And we know that education is a provincial jurisdiction responsibility. At the same time, of course, we also want to link the federal link and how to see how the federal government can use its influence to have those curriculum taught across the country. But at the same time, though, we also need to think about not just the curriculum, it is a system change. It is a system change in also the education system. Who will be teaching the curriculum? What are the skill sets of these teachers? Do they really understand anti-racism? Do they understand the intersectionality of issues. And what about the education? Like, who are the teachers? Do we have Asian Canadian teachers that can actually talk about their lived experiences? And do we have Asian Canadians across in terms of decision-making positions within the education system, be it as in principals, vice principals, or directorship at the Board of Education? So I think it is an issue that we need to look beyond just pushing for curriculum. It is an issue to push for systemic change, as we have been trying to push for systemic change across all sectors, education, healthcare, and all that. And I would encourage, young people to always apply that kind of lens, that systemic change, apply those principles and values of not just, of course, racism, as Winnie keeps reminding us, the intersectionality of oppression, right? Gender-based oppression, and LGBTQ rights and all that. So as young people, I would encourage to apply that in whatever you do, that would really be of your passion, and use that lens to advance the work within your power. And of course, join advocacy groups that you think would advance the passion of your life. Join CCNS-SJ or local community groups wherever you are in the country. So I think the ultimate message, I think it's that system change. So it's not just getting the curriculum, but really the whole system, so that the lived experiences and building the identity of Asian Canadians, as Brad and Susan and everybody is saying, is the most important. So we are fully recognized as Canadians, that we are not the model minorities, and we are not the perpetual foreigners, as Gary has said. So I would like to emphasize that, and I would encourage all young people to come with those lens and push for that. Thank you.
And as a young person would say after a powerful speech, we say period. So thank you, Amy, so much. I have another question, open-ended question. What is the model minority myth, and how do we dispel this? I've seen so many think pieces. I think there was one in the Toronto Star written by Angela and Francis, which was great. But what is the model minority myth, and how do we dispel this? Anyone? I'm just waiting on a hand emoji. Gary, thank you.
I think all of us can answer it. I'll just the awkward silence, I'll fill it. No, I mean the model minority myth is something that affects not just Chinese, but I think East Asian and South Asian Canadians, and its origins. I acknowledge to learning some of this myself, just in Asian Heritage Month and being part of groups and listening to other people. The origins were actually in the 1960s in US, and it was used to put down the civil rights movement, and referring to Japanese Americans as, look how successful they are, and they don't need anything from government, they're not complaining. So that's one of the aspects of the model minority myth that is damaging. It helps to separate and divide the different racialized communities. Looking more inwardly within our own community, sure, we joke about it, right? As Chinese people, about good at math, or doctors, lawyers. We can joke about it, but we also need to recognize the harm it causes, not only to other racialized groups, but within our own community. For those who do not conform, it puts pressure. And there's just recently I was listening to someone in another webinar talk about a binary. You're either model minority, or you're dangerous, you're evil, you're no good. And so it puts that kind of pressure. If you do not match that model minority status, then you're all the way the other way. Look at the pandemic. It didn't help us. Being the model minority didn't help us at all. So these are the kind of things that are just used against us when those with power and influence when it suits them, they'll say, oh, model minority, and boost us up and give us those benefits, the proximity to whiteness, right? So that we try to be more like white people, and in that way we benefit. And at other times, it'll be used against us. And we are all of a sudden the perpetual foreigner, or the people who are a threat. And so these are the kind of things that will happen when you stereotype someone, when you do not see that a whole community, a whole people are diverse. We're not a monolith. These things are all tied together in how racism shows itself.
I see Susan and Brad too. Susan, do you want to go? Oh, you're muted, Susan. Still muted. I don't know.
Okay.
There you go. You're all good.
There you go. There are too many buttons up there. There's also something more pernicious of the model minority myth, because in addition to being dismissed by saying, oh, it's more that on one hand, it's a backhanded compliment. Oh, there's no problem because this is one of those groups that, in one generation, achieves professional status, or that they're all wealthy and so on. And what that does is it invokes envy. It also creates a problem when you do speak out, because in order to maintain your model minority status, you have to keep quiet. Keep your head down and be nice and quiet. So the minute you complain about something or raise something, suddenly you've broken the contract, the social contract. Furthermore, it doesn't protect you. We'd be happy to stay nice and quiet if you were protected from it. But in fact, one of the things that was really disheartening to find out during this pandemic and the anti-Asian racism that was provoked was that there were people who were, first of all, several generations Canadian, many of them professionals. We had one emergency room doctor who was, attacked verbally, if almost not physically. Despite having achieved, and she was actively going to save their life, and yet she was still attacked. So there's that kind of problem. Plus, there's the concern that, if a group is thought to be doing very well, why then there's no need to do anything for them. Yet there are high rates of poverty in the Asian Canadian community. And so when you deal with issues of poverty among disadvantaged groups, no one thinks that the Chinese community is one of those that you have to deal with. So it's really, sometimes our parents might have said, just, keep your head down, make lots of money, become a doctor or a lawyer, and you'll be fine. In fact, it doesn't take care of you in the future. So it is a, double-edged sword.
Thank you, Susan. Brad, you're up.
Yeah, thanks. So I think about this a little bit differently. We talk about the myth of the model minority as originating down in the States during the Civil Rights Movement. And, sometimes you'll hear Canadians will say, well, that's just kind of borrowed and it's not really Canadian. We're not like that. Well, then I would ask people to think about the idea and the evolution of multiculturalism. When it first started out in the early 1970s under Pierre Elliott Trudeau, so Trudeau Sr., it was actually set up as a wedge issue, as a wedge community, like anybody who's racialized, to put a wedge between the two solitudes in Canada that Pierre Elliott Trudeau often described. And those two solitudes were English and French Canada. Now, of course, through the years, what multiculturalism has moved from a wedge issue to something that encompasses, or is supposed to encompass, all Canadian values. It's quite a bit different. So I think we need to take a harder look at our own history. We have to do a critical rethink of our Canadian history and what our stated values are, and not always get the values mixed up with the actual reality of what history has shown. There's a lot to learn from our history. There's a lot to learn from being honest with ourselves.
And I guess an important part of that history is oral histories, just like the oral histories that we heard today. and aren't always in the textbooks, aren't always in the education, is not always in the curriculum. How do we do more of this? Where do we find more oral history? What resources do we have access to today to find out more of this history so we can better equip ourselves with what happened in the past, and what more needs to be done so these resources are more accessible? That was for Brad, but it can be for anyone.
Oh, there's a lot of resources that are online, but and I guess there is probably a formalized collection in Library and Archives Canada, but it doesn't cover the breadth, and it doesn't cover the breadth of actually the diversity within the community. One of the things that's happened as of late, because of the attendant racism that's associated with the pandemic, and the fact that Canadians' first response to COVID-19 was in fact racism and nothing else, was the revitalization of Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, in which many of us are involved. One thing that I've worked on with CCNS-SJ is the hashtag Face Race campaign, and of building content and website content for it. But it's basically a challenge to all Canadians to face up to racism, to not just say, well, that's not us, and then be done with the argument. Get out and get to know your neighbors and get to know their racialized histories in Canada, and all the differences that those perceptions bring. So, Face Race is a good starting point. It also documents the history of the experience of racism in 2020, 2021. So it's not that we're just talking about history, we're actually talking about effects on the present.
Thank you, Gary. I think I was supposed to keep this to 20 minutes. I think we went a little bit over, but I found this entire discussion so insightful. Thank you all for being so generous with your time and sharing your experiences on a movement that not only galvanized our community, but also created a template for today's activists. And thank you everyone else who participated in this video documentary or panel or event. And thank you for tuning in for today's roundtable. This roundtable was recorded and will be available through the websites of the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice and the Multicultural History Society of Ontario, together with other links to resources where we can all read more about any of these issues. I believe it'll also be on YouTube, so we'll have a link to share around in the coming days. I'd also like to acknowledge the team working behind the scenes to make this event happen: Elliot Guinea and Dora Nip from the Multicultural History Society of Ontario, Lauren Foster from the Institute for Social Research at York University, and Alicia Flipowicz of the York Center for Asian Research. Thank you all. We couldn't have done it without you. And thank you again for tuning in. Thank you to our panelists, and everyone, keep well, stay safe, and most importantly, get involved.